Children exhibit racial and ethnic biases from a young age. We as a group had an interest in learning racial and ethnic bias development to reduce prejudice studies as an attempt to understand where these biases originate.
Studies began to look at the origins of racial biases in the 1930s with related topics such as the acquisition of ethnic awareness. These early research employed ethnic preference techniques in which researchers asked kids who they liked the best, who they wanted to sit next to, or who they wanted to play ball with. Classic doll studies also similarly presented children with a pair of identical dolls with different skin color, and asked kids questions such as, "Point to the doll you want to play with." Kids' responses to these tasks reflected their ethnic preferences, and an evaluation of these responses showed that children could distinguish people based on physical cues such as skin color from a very young age. Beginning in the 1950s, researchers proposed theories to explain these findings. Adorno and his colleagues first theorized that children who grow up in strict families or communities develop an authoritarian personality that show excessive conformity and submission to authority, and hostility towards those who deviate from conventions. The social learning theory emerged in 1954 and suggested that children learn prejudice from observing and imitating parents and teachers. Similarly, the intergroup contact theory, also proposed in 1954, offered that prejudice grew from the lack of personal and positive contact among individuals of different groups.
Meet Alex. Alex is going to be our development tour guide. We're going to follow Alex's bias development through life, from his first few months into his adolescence.
But before we begin to follow Alex's development of biases, let's look at how acquisition of biases might affect him and his peers. Research suggests that attitudes and group dynamics, in addition to individual aggressive tendencies and peer influence, may underlie intergroup bullying. Their tendencies to favor their own group and attribute blame to the outgroup may underlie such conflicts. Children's biases may not only affect others but also their own beliefs, thoughts, and actions. For example, Alex in 4th grade may do well in homework assignments, but when his teacher announces that the class will take a test to assess how much they have learned, Alex usually does poorly. Stereotype threats may explain this inconsistency. Kids, especially those from stigmatized groups, may readily absorb ethnic and gender stereotypes during development. Stereotype threats, which refers to the fear of being judged on these negative stereotypes, can trigger anxiety, and this anxiety may interfere with performance. This may consequently lower Alex's self-esteem. With a reduced self-esteem on academics, Alex may lose interest or feel discouraged in putting in more efforts.
So let's go back and talk about babies. Biased babies. Babies are curious and cute. We can use a baby's visual attention to assess their preference for one stimulus. We can measure Alex's preference using the visual preference paradigm. As we know, the brain filters relevant versus irrelevant information. This is the reason humans can still beat computers in various tasks. We accomplish this through selective covert visual attention. Covert attention means that no overtly visible action is made to select between the different sources of information. Essentially, it's what your brain naturally decides to do. The word implicit comes to mind. Humans show two different forms of attention. Bottom-up attention is when a stimulus causes neural activity at the different processing levels, which may affect the focus of attention. Top-down attention is when the individual is internally biased towards particular stimuli, depending on the task or on the interpretation of the task to be performed. The visual preference paradigm allows us to measure the implicit biases as a result of top-down attention. Here's an example. Which one of these two images do you think our newborn Alex visually prefers? Hopefully, it's the pleasant blocks and not the tax form. Now, let's look at this next image. Which do you visually prefer? It's okay to say G block. We've all been there. But let's get back to the babies. The visual preference paradigm is how we're able to measure Alex's biases since newborns can't take the IAT. Newborns have been proven to be horrible at taking tests, and it has something to do with being 2 days old, I guess. However, they are excellent at looking at things. Let's explore Alex's bias development during his first few months. In Kelly et al., it was found that 3-month-olds, but not newborns, prefer own race faces. At birth, Alex would show no preference based on ethnicity. He does show preferences, such as that for his mother's face, and even for attractive faces over unattractive faces. However, at 3 months, Alex has begun to develop a bias in preference for his own ethnic group. Similarly, assuming he had a female caregiver, he prefers female faces and can better discriminate among female faces. We have discussed the other race effect in class, as well as the fusiform face area, and this research suggests that we may start developing this ability to differentiate faces, or lack thereof, during infancy. Alex would likely be able to better discriminate faces of his own racial group as well. Alex's understanding of faces is rooted in the concept of a face space. A face space is a norm-based coding model in which faces are encoded as vectors according to their deviation from a prototypical average. At birth, the dimensions of the prototype are likely to be broad and largely unspecified, with development of the prototype being dependent on facial input. Alex is effectively able to recognize his neighbor John's face. But what if we change some of the dimensions, such as the size of John's nose? Alex is less sure, but at least has some baseline for reference. Predominant exposure to faces of a specific gender or ethnicity early in life may result in both the physiognomic and skin color dimensions of Alex's prototype becoming tuned towards such faces. So some conclusions we can make about ethnic bias development. Preferential selectivity based on ethnic differences is not present in the first days of life. It is learned within the first 3 months. Adults' perceptions of ethnic differences may be learned and derived from differences in exposure to own versus other race faces during early development, leading to the other race effect. The good news is that biases are plastic. We can definitely combat the other race effect and minimize our bias against outgroups if you diversify a baby's and your own visual experiences.
Now let's follow Alex into his childhood and explore how he starts to make sense of the world and himself. During early childhood, kids begin to expand their evaluation of themselves and construct a self-concept. Early on, it'll be basic. Alex, at around 3 years old, may introduce himself as,
"My name is Alex. I am 3 years old."
Around this age, self-concepts mostly consist of observable characteristics. Kids then begin to understand psychological characteristics, and around 5 to 7 years old, Alex may say,
"I'm kind and shy."
Then 10-year-old Alex may start comparing himself to others. He may realize that he's not the best swimmer. Alex may say,
"I'm a good pianist, but not as good at swimming as my friends."
But what about how he understands, perceives, and describes others? How children perceive people and assign their traits to categories are similar to how children develop a concept of themselves. Older preschoolers first begin to describe personality traits with noticing and mentioning the consistent actions or behaviors of their peers. For example, 8-year-old Alex may notice that his friend Jenna repeatedly steals and lies at school. He may say she steals and lies, but then begin to use more vague stereotyped language such as mean and other more positive words, good, nice, I act smart, to describe other, friendlier playmates. Gradually, Alex utilizes sharper trait descriptions such as honest, polite, generous, selfish. Children's stereotype about social groups can strongly influence how they perceive others. As mentioned earlier, ethnic preference studies found that 3 and 4-year-olds form basic concepts of race and ethnicity. Young children seem to grasp the prevailing societal attitudes on different race from implicit messages in the environment. So who do we blame? Researchers have looked at the transmission of racial attitudes within families, but have not found clear correlations between parents and children's attitudes. Studies suggest that perhaps parents and friends rarely show their racial and ethnic views or are reluctant to address the subject. Given the situation where children are provided with limited or ambiguous information, children seem to fill in the gaps with their experiences in the environment. Telzer and their colleagues tested this role of social environment in shaping effective perceptions of race. Specifically, they hypothesized that neurobiases emerged over development and used fMRIs to examine the amygdala's sensitivity in response to race across childhood. The amygdala is a brain region involved in processing and responding to emotional stimuli based on past experiences. The amygdala is able to learn socially constructed values placed on social groups and able to acquire significant affective associations. Although the amygdala is structurally mature by early childhood, its functional processing, such as race-related processing, undergoes massive changes, especially in adolescence. According to Telzer, These social reorientations of the amygdala, along with the development of cognitive skills and the increasing salience of race, may contribute to an enhanced amygdala response to race. This graph shows a positive correlation of age and amygdala responses. Results confirmed that the amygdala becomes increasingly sensitive to African American faces across development, and that adults' heightened amygdala activity to African American faces did not appear in early childhood. This indicates that amygdala responsivity to race results from developmental processes in which amygdala acquires emotional knowledge and becomes more sensitive through experiences. Telser also suggests that children internalize cultural biases and norms in their environment across development, and that this heightened amygdala response may reflect learned cultural knowledge such as implicit and explicit stereotypes.
Adolescence. Another perspective on development of bias can be observed in this stage of maturation. Ranging from age 10 to 19, adolescence is a period between childhood and adulthood. Some of us, if not most of us, might not want to admit that these were once going on in our brains when we were teenagers, or at least this was what we thought was going on. Unfortunately, this is not the actual depiction of our emotionally unstable/rebellious brains. If we pay close attention to every single part of this hypothetical brain, we can see that these are the outcomes of the progression of our actual brains. Here we meet Alex again, but right now Alex has reached puberty and his favorite thing is pulling pranks on someone. What changed him? Here's the actual depiction of what is going on with our brains during adolescence period. If we compare it with the 5-year-old brain that was presented earlier, we can see a massive progression in some parts of the brain. One of the areas with the most prominent distinction is the prefrontal cortex area. As mentioned earlier, 5-year-olds are still unable to keep up with complex information and make decisions. Although our 14-year-old brains can do such things, we still lack a few aspects of maturation. Other than not being able to process information effectively, 14-year-olds still lack executive functional skills that allow them to make rational decisions. It explains the reckless behavior that most teenagers tend to possess. Unfortunately, our prefrontal cortex will not be fully developed until we reach our 20s. From a study that was conducted by Teslers and her colleagues in 2013, individuals start to develop biases toward a certain race group. Adolescents appear to be more sensitive to group affiliations and their accompanying social identities than both children and adults. They are more responsive than ever towards social stimuli. It is believed that the presence of racial or ethnic groups become prominent at this time, especially in school. Another region that is essential during development of adolescent's brain is the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is responsible for reward processing. In fact, there is a high level of dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens area when the subject is stimulated rewarding behaviors. Adolescents differ from children and adults in nucleus accumbens. Enhanced accumbens activity itself is seen to be more similar to adults than children. Nucleus accumbens development may overcome the effect of orbitofrontal cortex during adolescence. In teenagers, this is one of the areas that develop early. The number of dopamine receptors increases when adolescents hit puberty, and it tends to increase until they reach adulthood. Therefore, during that period, the reward system is oftentimes overly reacted, and it becomes the reason why teenagers are more prone to perform activities impulsively as long as it engages a dopamine release. Children from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds living in similar geographical areas are exposed to similar messages about race throughout their environment. There is an importance of being exposed to diverse social environments such as neighborhood and school diversity in shaping perceptions of race. This bias is only present for infants living in racially homogeneous neighborhoods, and infants living in a heterogeneous environment do not exhibit an in-group bias. In teenagers, the urge to perform highly driven reward processing combined with the incomplete development of executive control of the prefrontal cortex can be fatal. Since they are unable to come up with rational decisions, they tend to act recklessly without considering the impacts of their actions. This explains why teenager behaviors are often more questionable and reasonable.
So what can we do to combat the development of biases and reduce acquired biases among children? We can encourage kids to view others' personality traits as malleable. Kids who believe that personality traits are fixed often ignore the motives and circumstances that underlie other people's actions. Helping kids understand that people's traits are rather changeable helps kids view other out-group kids as similar to them and blur the socially constructed boundaries of these groups. Intergroup contacts may then effectively reduce prejudice. A study found that children assigned to cooperative learning groups of diverse backgrounds showed lower levels of prejudice and formed more cross-race friendships. Another study reports that sharing thoughts and feelings with such close cross-race friends can reduce even subtle, unintentional prejudices. Tauser, whose studies were previously mentioned, also looked at the effects of diversity in environment on neural responses to race. This graph indicates that children with more diverse friends show amygdala activation to African American faces, meaning children exposed to diverse communities and have more cross-race classmates were less likely to exhibit neural biases to African American faces. These findings again highlight the significance of peer diversity in environment